The camera opens on a dimly lit garage workshop in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where vintage car parts and tools create dramatic shadows under a single hanging light. Engine oil stains the concrete floor, and the smell of old metal and grease fills the air. In the center of this automotive sanctuary sits Nora Thorne, a 28-year-old woman with calloused hands and grease-stained work clothes, holding a piece of yellowed paper that trembles in her grasp. When I found that handwritten letter sealed inside, my grandfather's engine block, I never expected it to reveal a 50-year-old secret that would change everything I thought I knew about his war service. Nora's voice carries the weight of disbelief and raw emotion as she looks directly into the camera, her green eyes reflecting both shock and heartbreak. Behind her, partially visible under harsh workshop lighting, sits a 1968 Ford Mustang GT 390, fastback in Highland blue. Its hood is open like a patient on an operating table, with engine components scattered across nearby workbenches. This isn't just any classic car restoration project. This is the final gift from William Bill Thorne, a Vietnam War veteran who raised Nora after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8 years old. The camera slowly zooms in on Nora's face as a single tear rolls down her cheek, leaving a clean streak through the smudge of engine grease on her skin. She holds up the letter, and viewers can see the faded military-style handwriting, though the specific words remain unreadable from this distance. The paper appears aged and oil-stained, suggesting it has been hidden for decades in the most unlikely of places. "My grandfather Bill was everything to me," Nora continues, her voice gaining strength despite her obvious emotional turmoil. "He taught me how to rebuild carburetors before I could ride a bike. He showed me that fixing broken things wasn't just about mechanics, it was about patience, respect, and love. But he never told me about this." She gestures toward the letter, and her voice cracks slightly. The workshop around her tells the story of their shared passion. Vintage automotive posters cover the walls, and a collection of restored muscle car engines sits proudly on display stands. A hand-painted sign reading "Thorne's Classic Revival" hangs prominently, showing this is more than a hobby garage. This is a business built on the foundation of knowledge passed down from grandfather to granddaughter. Nora sets the letter down carefully on her workbench, treating it like the precious artifact it has become. 6 months ago, Bill lost his battle, with emphysema caused by Agent Orange exposure. He left me this Mustang, his pride and joy, but also his biggest regret. He always said we'd get it running together someday, but that day never came. Her voice becomes steadier, more determined. "I thought restoring this car would help me feel closer to him. I never imagined it would introduce me to a family I never knew existed." The camera pulls back to reveal the full scope of the workshop, emphasizing both the intimacy of this moment and the larger story about to unfold. Tools are scattered exactly where Bill left them, as if he might walk back in at any moment to finish what he started. A coffee cup with "World's Best Grandpa" still sits on the workbench, a painful reminder of the daily routines that ended too soon. "What I found inside that engine block didn't just change how I saw my grandfather," Nora says, looking back at the Mustang with a mixture of love and apprehension. "It changed how I understood love itself, sacrifice, and what it really means to carry someone's legacy forward." She pauses, collecting herself before delivering the hook that will keep viewers engaged. Because sometimes the most important repairs aren't the ones you can see. Let me take you back to 6 months earlier, to the day that changed everything. Bill Thorne's funeral was held on a crisp October morning at Cedar Falls Memorial Chapel, with military honors befitting a man who served 2 tours in Vietnam, though at the time, I only knew about one. The honor guard folded that American flag with precision that seemed almost mechanical, yet their faces showed genuine respect for the old veteran who'd become a fixture in our small Iowa community. I remember standing there in my only black dress, feeling completely lost as they handed me that triangle of fabric. At 28 years old, I thought I understood grief. I'd lost my parents in a car accident when I was 8, but Bill had been there to catch me, to rebuild me just like he rebuilt engines. His death felt different, final. There was no one left to catch me this time. After the service, people kept telling me how proud Bill was of me, how he'd brag about his Nora, who could rebuild a transmission faster than most men could change their oil. They meant well, but their words felt hollow. What they didn't understand was that without Bill, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be anymore. Thorne's classic revival sits on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, in a converted barn that Bill and I had spent 3 summers transforming into the perfect restoration workshop. We'd built everything together, from the hydraulic lifts to the custom tool organization system that made sense only to us. The sign outside still bears both our names, painted in the same font as the 1960s Ford dealership signs that Bill collected. The business had grown beyond our wildest dreams. We specialized in muscle cars from the 1960s and 70s, with a particular expertise in Fords and Chevrolets. Car enthusiasts would drive from as far as Chicago and Kansas City to have us restore their dream machines. Bill had a gift for seeing potential where others saw scrap metal, and somehow he'd passed that vision onto me. But after his funeral, I couldn't bring myself to touch anything in the shop. The 1967 Camaro SS that needed a paint job sat exactly where we'd left it. The 1970 Dodge Challenger with transmission problems remained on the lift, waiting for repairs that felt impossible to complete without Bill's guidance. Everything reminded me of him, of conversations we'd never finish, of projects we'd never complete together. The worst reminder sat in the corner of the shop, hidden under a faded blue tarp like some mechanical ghost. Bill's 1968 Ford Mustang GT 390 Fastback in Highland Blue, the car that represented both his greatest pride and his deepest frustration. He'd bought it in 1969, just after returning from his first tour in Vietnam. It was supposed to be his celebration, his reward for surviving a war that had claimed too many of his friends. "Someday we'll get her purring again," he used to say, patting the Mustang's fender with the same gentle affection he'd shown me as a child. "Someday when I'm feeling stronger." But someday never came. The Agent Orange exposure that the VA finally acknowledged in his last years had damaged his lungs too severely. The simple act of working under a hood left him gasping for breath. I knew the car's history by heart. Bill had driven it for exactly 18 months before the engine started making noises that even his expert ear couldn't diagnose. Rather than risk further damage, he'd parked it in the barn and covered it up, promising himself and me that it was just temporary. That was over 40 years ago. My best friend and business partner, Zoe Camden, had been watching me avoid that corner of the shop for months. Zoe and I had known each other since high school, and she'd been there through every major moment of my adult life, including the day I decided to turn my passion for cars into a career. She understood engines almost as well as I did, but more importantly, she understood me. "You can't keep pretending it's not there," Zoe had said one Tuesday morning in late March, her arms crossed as she stood next to the coffee maker we'd installed near the office area. "Every time you walk past that tarp, you look like you've seen a ghost." She wasn't wrong. The Mustang had become a daily reminder of failure, of promises unkept and dreams deferred. It represented everything I'd lost and everything I was afraid I'd never be able to fix. Bill had always been the one with the solutions, the one who could diagnose problems that stumped other mechanics. Without him, I felt like I was just pretending to know what I was doing. "It's not that simple," I'd told her, focusing intently on rebuilding a carburetor for a customer's 1965 Thunderbird. "That car's different. It meant everything to him." "Exactly," Zoe replied, her voice gentle but firm, "which is why you need to either restore it or let it go. This limbo you're keeping it in isn't honoring his memory. It's just prolonging your pain." The conversation had been building for weeks. Zoe worried about me, about how I'd withdrawn from friends, from customers, from life itself. She watched me work 16-hour days just to avoid going home to an empty house, saw how I'd lost weight and stopped taking care of myself. The vibrant woman who used to joke with customers and take pride in her work had been replaced by someone going through the motions. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in early April. I'd been struggling with a particularly stubborn brake line replacement on a 1971 Chevelle when Zoe approached me with news that felt like a betrayal. "I got a call this morning," she said, her tone carefully neutral. There's a collector in Des Moines, Mr. Reynolds, who specializes in unrestored muscle cars. Someone told him about Bill's Mustang. I stopped what I was doing and looked up at her, grease streaking my forearms. What kind of call? He's offering $85,000 for it, as is. No restoration required. Zoe held up her hand before I could respond. I told him I'd have to talk to you, but Nora, that's serious. Money. That could solve your financial problems and maybe give you some closure. The number hit me like a physical blow. $85,000 would indeed solve the business's cash flow problems that had developed since Bill's medical bills started piling up. It would allow me to pay off the equipment loans and maybe even expand the shop. From a purely practical standpoint, it made perfect sense. But the thought of that Highland blue Mustang sitting in someone else's garage, possibly never to run again, felt like selling a piece of Bill's soul. It felt like admitting that some things were truly beyond repair, that some promises would remain forever broken. I need time to think about it, I said, returning to the brake line with more force than necessary. You've had 6 months to think, Zoe replied, her patience finally wearing thin. Look, I love you, and I loved Bill like family, but this isn't healthy. You're destroying yourself over a car that might not even be worth saving. What if the engine is completely seized? What if the restoration costs more than the car's worth? Her questions echoed the doubts that kept me awake at night. Bill had always been optimistic about the Mustang's condition, but optimism doesn't fix mechanical problems. What if decades of sitting had caused irreparable damage? What if I started the restoration only to discover that his dream car was actually a nightmare of rust, corrosion, and mechanical failure? Fine, I finally said, not looking up from my work. But I'm doing this alone. This is between me and Grandpa Bill. Zoe nodded, understanding that this decision was about more than just a car. It was about facing grief, about testing whether the skills Bill had taught me were strong enough to honor his memory properly. It was about discovering whether I had inherited not just his knowledge, but his courage to attempt the impossible. The following Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly as I finally approached that blue tarp in the corner of the shop. I'd been circling it for an hour like it might bite me, sipping coffee that had gone cold, and finding excuses to organize tools that were already perfectly organized. Zoe had wisely made herself scarce, understanding that this moment needed to be mine alone. When I finally pulled away the tarp, my heart sank immediately. The Highland. Blue paint that Bill always bragged about was worse than I'd imagined. What had once been a stunning metallic finish was now a patchwork of surface rust, primer spots, and oxidation that told the story of 4 decades of neglect. The chrome bumpers had pitted, and the iconic side stripes were cracked and peeling, like sunburned skin, but it was when I popped the hood that the real devastation became clear. The GT390 engine, the heart of this muscle car, looked like it had been sitting at the bottom of a lake. Corrosion covered every surface, and when I tried to turn the crankshaft with a breaker bar, it wouldn't budge even a fraction of an inch. The engine wasn't just damaged, it was completely seized. Son of a bitch, I whispered, the words echoing in the empty shop. Bill had always described the engine as just needing some attention. He'd never mentioned that it was completely locked up, probably had been for years before he'd even parked the car. The discovery hit me harder than I expected. Bill had lied to me, or at least hidden the full truth. All those years of him talking about getting her running again someday, he'd known it was virtually impossible. The restoration wouldn't be a matter of replacing a few parts and tuning the carburetor. This would require a complete engine rebuild, possibly a full replacement. As I stared at the mechanical carnage under the hood, anger started mixing with my grief. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he let me believe that this restoration was just waiting for the right weekend, the right motivation? Had he been protecting me from disappointment? Or had he been protecting himself from admitting that his dream was dead? I spent the next hour documenting everything with my phone, taking pictures of every angle, every problem, every component that would need attention. The list grew overwhelming quickly. Beyond the seized engine, I discovered that mice had made nests in the air cleaner. The brake lines were completely corroded. The fuel tank would need replacement, and the interior looked like it had been attacked by moths and time. The deeper I dug, the more questions arose. I found Bill's old toolbox wedged behind the passenger seat, something I'd never seen before. Inside, beneath layers of old shop rags and spare parts, I discovered a manila envelope, marked military records, personal, in Bill's careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The documents inside told a story that Bill had never shared with me. His DD-2114 discharge papers showed not one tour in Vietnam, but two. The first from 1967 to 1968, then a second deployment from 1969 to 1970. All those years, I'd believed he'd served just one tour, that he'd bought the Mustang as a celebration of coming home safe. But there was more. Medical records from the VA showed his Agent Orange exposure was far more severe than he'd ever admitted. The paperwork documented symptoms going back to the early 1980s, decades before he'd finally sought treatment. He'd been fighting the effects of chemical exposure for most of my life, hiding his pain behind stories about the good times, the cars we'd restore together, the dreams we'd chase. Among the medical papers, I found something that made my chest tighten with emotion. A letter from the VA dated just 2 months before his death, approving a significant increase in his disability compensation. The monthly amount would have been enough to cover a professional restoration of the Mustang, with money left over. He'd finally gotten the financial help he needed, but his body had deteriorated too far to enjoy it. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. All those years of him talking about someday, and someday had finally arrived just as his lungs gave out. Called Zoe, needing someone to witness what I'd discovered. She arrived 20 minutes later with sandwiches and the kind of practical energy that always helped me think clearly. "It's worse than we thought," I told her, gesturing toward the engine compartment. Zoe peered under the hood and let out a low whistle. "Okay, that's pretty bad, but not impossible. You've rebuilt engines in worse condition. Not 390s, and definitely not with the budget we're working with." I showed her the parts list I'd started, along with preliminary cost estimates I'd looked up online. We're talking about $15,000 to $20,000 minimum, and that's assuming I do all the labor myself. The number hung in the air between us like a challenge. It was more than double what I'd expected, and it didn't include bodywork, interior restoration, or the dozen smaller systems that would need attention. "What about Reynolds's offer?" Zoe asked gently. $85,000. Starts looking pretty good when you're staring at a $20,000 project, I admitted. But even as I said it, the thought of that Highland blue Mustang sitting in someone else's garage, possibly never to run again, felt like betrayal. That's when I found the photographs. They were tucked into a service manual for 390 engines. Photos I'd never seen before. Bill as a young soldier, impossibly young and lean in his army fatigues. Bill with his squad, guys whose names I'd heard in stories but never seen faces to match. And then, a photo that stopped me cold. Bill standing next to the Mustang, but not as I'd ever seen it. This photo showed the car in perfect condition, paint gleaming, chrome spotless. But what caught my attention was the date stamped on the back. June 1971, 2 years after he'd bought it, a year after his second tour ended. In the photo, Bill looked happy but also haunted, like a man trying to convince himself that normal life was possible. "He drove it longer than he told me," I said, showing Zoe the photo. "Look at this. The car was perfect in 1971. Something happened. After this, more photos revealed the timeline. The Mustang in perfect condition through 1971, then gradually declining in later photos. By 1974, it was already showing signs of neglect. Whatever had caused Bill to stop driving his dream car, it hadn't been immediate mechanical failure. It had been something else, something that had made him lose interest in the thing he'd once loved most. As the afternoon wore on, I discovered more hidden items throughout the car. Old photos of my parents tucked into the glove compartment. My childhood drawings rolled up and stored in the door panels. Military medals that he'd never displayed, wrapped carefully and hidden under the rear seat. Each discovery painted a picture of a man who'd used this car as a vault for his most precious memories and his deepest pain. The final straw came when I found his Purple Heart. Bill had never mentioned being wounded in Vietnam. The medal was wrapped in tissue paper, along with a hospital bracelet from a military medical facility in Japan. The dates showed he'd been hospitalized for 6 weeks during his second tour, something he'd never told me about. By evening, I was emotionally exhausted and more confused than ever. The Bill I thought I knew, the grandfather who'd raised me with patience and love, was apparently just one facet of a much more complicated man. He'd hidden decades of pain, physical and emotional, behind stories about cars and dreams of restoration. Projects we'd complete together. I don't know who he really was. I confessed to Zoe as we locked up the shop. He was the man who loved you enough to protect you from his pain, she replied. The question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Bill's secrets weighing on me like physical objects. The Mustang wasn't just a restoration project anymore. It was an archaeological dig into the hidden corners of my grandfather's life, and I was starting to realize that some discoveries can't be undone. I woke up the next morning with a clarity that surprised me. The confusion and anger from the previous day had crystallized into something else entirely: determination. As I made coffee in my kitchen, staring out at the shop where the Mustang waited under its harsh fluorescent lights, I realized that Bill's secrets didn't diminish what he'd taught me. If anything, they proved how much he'd overcome to become the man who raised me. If Grandpa could survive 2 tours in Vietnam with injuries he never talked about, I can survive rebuilding one engine. I said aloud to the empty house, my voice steady for the first time in months. The decision felt right in my bones. I wasn't just going to restore the Mustang. I was going to do it properly, completely, the way Bill had always dreamed it could be done. The seized engine, the hidden damage, the financial strain, none of it mattered anymore. This wasn't about the car. This was about proving to myself that the values he'd instilled in me, patience, persistence, and respect for craftsmanship, were strong enough to honor his memory properly. I arrived at the shop that Monday morning with a plan. Instead of avoiding the Mustang, I pulled it into the center bay and raised it on the hydraulic lift. Zoe watched with concern as I began the methodical process of completely disassembling the engine, but she didn't try to stop me. "You're really doing this," she said, more statement than question. "I'm really doing this." I hefted a seized piston out of its cylinder, examining the scoring and corrosion. "And I'm going to need your help finding parts." The research phase became an obsession. I spent evenings scouring online forums, calling specialty shops across the country, and connecting with other 390 enthusiasts who understood the challenge I'd taken on. The GT390 wasn't just any Ford engine. It was a high-performance beast that had powered some of the most iconic muscle cars ever built, and finding original components required patience and persistence. Through a forum dedicated to vintage Mustangs, I connected with collectors and restorers from California to Maine. Most were men in their 60s and 70s who'd grown up with these cars, but they welcomed me into their community with enthusiasm and respect. When I explained that I was restoring my grandfather's car, several offered to sell me parts at cost or even donate components they'd been hoarding. "Your grandfather sounds like he was one of the good ones," wrote a collector named Frank from Phoenix, who offered to ship me a rare intake manifold. "These cars deserve to live again." But it was my conversation with Tommy Vasquez that changed everything. I'd found his name in Bill's military records as part of his reconnaissance unit, and when I called the number listed in a veteran's directory, a gravelly voice answered on the third ring. "Tommy Vasquez." "Mr. Vasquez, my name is Nora Thorne. My grandfather was Bill Thorne. You served together in Vietnam." The silence that followed stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, Tommy said, "Billy Thorne. Jesus, I haven't heard that name in years. How is the old bastard?" "He passed away 6 months ago. Agent Orange finally got him." "Damn." Another pause. "He was a good soldier, your grandfather. Saved my life twice over there. Once, literally, dragged me out of an ambush when I took shrapnel in both legs. The second time, well, that's harder to explain." Tommy's words opened a window into Bill's service that I'd never imagined. He told me about their unit's mission, how they'd operated behind enemy lines gathering intelligence about the night Bill had carried Tommy 3 miles through hostile territory to reach a medical evacuation point. He never talked about the war, I said. I only found out yesterday that he served 2 tours. That sounds like Billy. He came back different after his second deployment. We all did, but him especially. He'd seen too much, done too much. The funny thing is, he used to write letters about you constantly. Even when you were just a little kid, he'd talk about teaching you to work on cars, about the bond you two had. He never mentioned you, or any of his army buddies. He wouldn't have. Billy had this way of compartmentalizing his life. The war was one box, his family was another. He never let them touch. Tommy paused, and I heard him light a cigarette. You said you're working on his car? His 1968 Mustang. It's in pretty rough shape. Ha! He bought that thing right after his first tour. Drove it to my wedding in Chicago in 1970. Beautiful machine. He was so proud of that car. Talked about it almost as much as he talked about you. Tommy's stories painted a picture of Bill that I'd never seen. A young veteran trying to build a normal life, using the Mustang as proof that he'd survived, that he could create something beautiful despite what he'd experienced. The car hadn't just been transportation or even a hobby. It had been therapy, hope, a tangible symbol of the life he was fighting to build. What happened during his second tour? I asked. Something changed him. The line went quiet again. When Tommy spoke, his voice was careful, measured. That's not my story to tell. But I will say this. Your grandfather carried some heavy weight from that second deployment. Things he did, things he saw, people he couldn't save. If you're really restoring that Mustang, you might find some answers along the way. That evening, as I carefully cleaned each engine component with the patience Bill had taught me, I felt him with me in a way I hadn't since his death. Not the idealized grandfather who'd protected me from hard truths, but the complete man who'd carried decades of pain while still finding ways to show love and pass on knowledge. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply rebuilding the engine, I would document every step of the restoration process. I would photograph every component, research every modification, and investigate every clue the car might hold. The Mustang would tell me Bill's complete story, the parts he'd shared and the parts he'd kept hidden. As I worked late into the night, methodically disassembling the engine block, I noticed something unusual. There appeared to be a sealed cavity in the engine that didn't belong in the original Ford design. Someone had deliberately modified this space, welding it shut with professional precision. My heart started pounding as I realized what I might have found. Bill hadn't just hidden photos and medals in the car's interior. He'd built a secret compartment inside the engine itself, a place where even the most thorough inspection wouldn't discover what he'd chosen to preserve. The cavity was perfectly sealed, waterproof, and positioned where it wouldn't affect the engine's operation when running. Whatever Bill had hidden inside had been protected for decades, waiting for someone skilled enough to completely disassemble the engine to find it. I set down my tools and stared at that sealed chamber, knowing that opening it would change everything. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but others are meant to be discovered by the right person at the right time. Bill had always told me that the most important repairs weren't visible from the outside. Looking at that hidden compartment, I finally understood what he meant. I spent that entire night researching how to find someone in Vietnam. By sunrise, I'd contacted 3 different veteran organizations, the Red Cross, and even the Vietnamese consulate in Chicago. The internet, for all its flaws, turned out to be a miracle when it came to reconnecting families separated by war. Through the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, I learned about programs specifically designed to help American veterans reconnect with families they'd left behind. The social worker I spoke with, Maria Santos, had handled dozens of similar cases over her 20-year career. Your grandfather's story isn't unique, Maria told me during our phone call. What's remarkable is that he preserved evidence and left you a way to find them. Most families never get that chance. With Maria's help, I located a David Nguyen living in Ho Chi Minh City who worked as a mechanical engineer for a German automotive company. The age matched perfectly. Using a translation service, I crafted a message in Vietnamese explaining who I was and including scanned copies of the photograph and letter. I sent the message on a Tuesday afternoon, never expecting the response that arrived 6 hours later. David had replied in perfect English, and his words made me cry happy tears for the first time since Bill's death. Dear Nora, I have been waiting my entire life to hear from my American family. My mother, Lynn, passed away 2 years ago, but she never stopped hoping that William would find us. She kept every letter he sent, every photograph, every dollar. He managed to get through to us over the years. She taught me English by reading his letters aloud. Your grandfather was the love of her life. David's message included dozens of photographs spanning 5 decades. Pictures of him growing up, graduating from university, getting married, and raising 2 children of his own. In every photo where he smiled, I could see Bill's expressions reflected back at me. The family resemblance was unmistakable. I became an engineer because my mother told me my father loved machines and fixing things. She said he could make anything run like new. I wanted to be like him, even though I'd never met him. Reading those words, I realized that Bill's legacy had crossed continents and generations. He'd passed his love of mechanical problem-solving to David the same way he'd passed it to me, through stories and hope rather than direct instruction. With renewed purpose, I threw myself into completing the Mustang restoration. The Vietnamese-American community in nearby Des Moines rallied around the project when they heard David's story. Shop owners donated parts, mechanics volunteered their time, and families shared meals with me as I worked late into the evenings. The car became more than a restoration project. It became a symbol of healing, proof that love can survive war, separation, and decades of silence. 8 months after finding that letter, I stood in the Cedar Falls airport holding a sign that read, "Welcome home, Uncle David." When he walked through the gate, I recognized him immediately. He had Bill's walk, Bill's way of studying everything with careful attention, and Bill's gentle smile. Our first conversation lasted 6 hours. David brought 2 suitcases filled with items Lynn had saved. Letters from Bill, photographs, and even automotive magazines he'd sent that she'd kept in perfect condition. Most importantly, he brought stories about a woman who'd raised their son with love and pride, never speaking bitterly about the man who'd been forced to leave them behind. The next morning we drove to the shop together. When David saw the restored Mustang, now gleaming in its original Highland blue paint with every component rebuilt to perfection, he ran his hands along the fender exactly like Bill used to do. "It's beautiful," he said in accented but clear English. My mother would have loved seeing this. We took that first drive together on a sunny October morning, almost exactly a year after Bill's death. As the GT390 engine purred beneath the hood, I realized that some restorations take generations to complete. Bill had started this project in 1969 when he fell in love with Lynn. I'd finished it in 2024 when I brought his son home. The Mustang runs perfectly now, but more importantly, our family is finally complete. David visits twice a year, and we're teaching his teenage son, my cousin Michael, how to maintain the engine that brought us all together. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the unexpected ways love connects families across time and distance. Sometimes the most important repairs aren't the ones you can see, but the ones that heal hearts separated by decades and oceans. Bill's goodbye wasn't hidden in that engine block. His hello was.